tape recorder. He gets a lot of credit. Your book mentions a man named Westinghouse who also gets a lot of credit for inventing the refrigerator, the electric range. But one man whom I never heard of in school, and I'm going to mention it, he won't be on the test, is a man named Nikola Tesla. There's been attempts to revive his memory. Nikola Tesla's big invention was he gave us alternating current. Thomas Edison did not understand alternating current, and Thomas Edison tried to sell direct current. Direct current will only flow over wire for about 2 or 3 miles, folk. Well, how do you get alternating? Well, alternating current, you step its voltage up to 10,000 volts and put it on high level power lines, and it will go hundreds of miles without losing very much power.
Kind of like how like cell phones have usually like reach one line to another, like far distances or whatever.
Yeah,
Kind of
I believe it's maybe a little bit off the subject, but I hear your point. But anyway, without alternating current, folk, electricity would not be very commonly found in homes. You'd have to have a generator every 2 or 3 miles apart, and it would be very expensive. But again, alternating current is the means by which we get, I mean, every building here in Metro Atlanta has 60 cycle. They finally decided it's 60 cycle, even though if you go to Europe and a lot of places, they're using 50 cycle AC, and they're using mostly 200 volts. We use 110 volts here, which is safer. Personally, I prefer our system to theirs. But now, we do have some devices that take 200 volts, like your clothes dryers, your air conditioners, take more power. They use 220 volts. Almost every home these days is wired up for 220. Be really, really careful, folk, when you play with that stuff, because it can zap you. Now, I heard of a man who's an electrician. He knew that 110 volts usually wouldn't hurt him, so he'd test out his electricity by sticking his finger in a socket. But one day he ate some salted peanuts, and he stuck his finger in a socket, and it killed him. It was a salt. The salt is an excellent conductor of electricity. Salt water, excellent conductor of electricity. Otherwise, water is an insulator, but salt water, too good a conductor of electricity. Now, I'll tell this about Thomas Edison.
Considering it's an acid. So
What's that?
Considering like salt is acid, right?
Yeah, it's salt. Yeah, sodium and chloride, 2 poisonous stuff mixed together makes salt. Yeah, any of you know what I'm talking about? Sodium and chloride mixed together. One of you nodding your head, you do. Yeah. All right. Thomas Edison wanted to be able to come back from the dead. I mean, well, for the first years of his life, he was an out atheist. But late in his life, he changed to being an agnostic. But he told his family, I'm going to put a picture of myself in this room, and if I can come back, I'll move the picture, and that way you'll know I've come back. His descendants are embarrassed about it, but nevertheless, the picture is still there. And every once in a while, some of his family go in that room, and there's a picture, it's not been moved. He was going to find a way to use electricity. Now, with all respect to Edison, I'm no electronics expert, but I probably know more electricity than he did. Again, because he did not use alternating current, and therefore his knowledge was very, very limited. He did not know anything about transistors, about integrated circuits. Again, all these things. Now, like the telephone, nobody knows who invented the automobile, because when the technology was right, maybe more than 100 men put together automobiles all at once.
Henry Ford.
Henry Ford did not invent the automobile, even though he put together one cheaply. We'll talk more about him later, but he did not invent it. But yeah, he made them. We're really quiet on, history books are quiet on who invented them. Now, about this time, a couple of women, well, more than a couple, but women decided that they should have the right to vote, that it was unfair. They were denied the right to vote by the 15th Amendment, so they kept pushing. 2 of the women I want you to remember, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony.
Susan B.
Now, there is a silver dollar circulating that has Susan B. Anthony's picture on it. I had one time. But anyway, Susan B. Anthony. worked hard to give women the right to vote. This was not to be done until after World War I. Now, if you study world history, you'll learn that the first nation to give women the right to vote was Norway, followed by a few others. World War I did a whole lot to elevate women, owing to the fact that while the men were away fighting the war, women had to run the factories and do a lot of the work. So it was up to the women to put the tanks together, put the airplanes together, put the machine guns together, and put the food together that the men were on the front were using. And they found ways to get these, to make sure that these jobs could be done by women. And women gained a lot as a result of World War I. But it was to be many years before women got the right to vote. All right. Now, oh yes, I must mention this. Your book tells you that the Charles Darwin's book, his title of his book was The Origin of Species. The real title was On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection for the Preservation and Enhancement of the Favored Races. The favored race was, now, folk, this is him, not me. The favored race was the white race. And it was up to the white race to either elevate the black races or the other races that were not as white, or eliminate them. And this led to Adolf Hitler doing what he did. And led to a whole lot of problems. In fact, in our own country, now this was going on as a kid. Couples who were known to be intellectually inferior were often sterilized against their knowledge and against their will. And again, when I was in high school, our teacher told us that there was a couple he knew in Kentucky. They didn't know it, but everybody around him knew it. They had been sterilized, and he said they would not have children no matter how much they tried. Again, because their IQs were so low. This was going on, yes, as recently as 50 years ago, yes.
How were they sterilized but didn't know it?
The doctors had a way of taking care of them when they went to see a doctor. Basically the doctors broke the patient-doctor trust, patient-doctor. A woman named Margaret Sanger, whom we'll talk about later, had a whole lot to do with it. She figured out a way to sterilize women whose IQs were known to be really low. The bad part about this, folk, all right, there was a Star Trek movie that came out years ago where they decided this fella, we can keep him here on board this ship because he made no significant contribution. But then you look into records. He himself made no significant contribution. His son led the first voyage to Saturn. We got to get him back to Earth fast. We can't change history. His son led the first trip to Saturn. Point being, even if a lot of times couples who are known to be mentally retarded can have children who are geniuses. Again, in the South, there was a big problem with lynching in the South. Now, this is in chapter 19. I'm going to mention now. Laws were passed called Jim Crow laws. Have any of you ever heard of Jim Crow? Okay, yeah, the older.
Jim Crow laws.
Jim Crow laws were laws that were designed to make sure that the black person stayed in his place and that black people did not elevate themselves and did not rise. They were designed to keep the black from holding office, from serving on juries and from voting, to deny blacks the rights of citizenship. And these laws were lumped together in what's called Jim Crow laws. Ida Wells was herself a black woman. Your book shows a picture of her, who some members, people close to her, had been lynched. And she worked hard to try to stop lynching. The problem was the politics in the South was controlled by racist people. And a lot of your northern people just did not want to stand up to the South anymore. They said we got our own lives, we got our own business to take care of, so they left the South alone. Now, eventually this was to change. Generations later, Northerners moved to the South in droves, and Southern politicians saw that they had to reconcile with the simple fact of life that the Northern people were going to vote. We're not as blatantly racist as the Southern people had been. All right. This takes us up to the election of 1870, or not 1880, election of 1880. By this time, all right, ever since Abraham Lincoln had been elected president, the Republicans had controlled the White House. Well, the election of 1876 had shown Republicans they could no longer wave the bloody shirt and say we're the party that saved the Union, that they had to rule with honesty. But in 1880, they still got another Republican in named James Garfield. Garfield had been a general during the Civil War, even as Grant and Hayes had been. Now, the main issue that Garfield ran on was an issue of civil service reform. Civil service, this was a matter of who got the government jobs. Like, as for instance, I mentioned there's an FCC office in Atlanta. Well, the FCC has a man called an engineer in charge, and he's appointed by the federal bureaucracy. He's part of the civil service. Every bureaucrat, like the Interstate Commerce Commission, had a hierarchy of bureaucrats. A bureaucrat at the top, and then bureaucrats underneath them, and bureaucrats underneath them. These were appointed as part of the civil service. And ever since the days of Andrew Jackson, civil service jobs had been given to persons who had supported the president. In other words, when Andrew Jackson was elected, he was elected as a Democrat. He fired all of the men, most of the men John Quincy Adams had appointed, and appointed his own men to take their place. And ever since, from that day on till the 1880s, every president who came along would generally, particularly if the president was from a different party, he'd fire the older men and put men who had supported him in office. This was called the spoils system. The spoils system. Putting your men into office, men who had supported you. Well, James Garfield came along and he promised to reform this, saying that just because a man had supported me doesn't mean he's the best man, and he wanted to get only really good men for the job. A lot of times these men who were appointed to a federal position, given a job in the federal bureaucracy, proved to be either incompetent or corrupt or both. Well, James Garfield was elected. He only served a few months before he was shot down by a man who was a disappointed office seeker. In other words, this man named Guiteau was upset because he had not been given an office even though he had supported Garfield. Now, like most assassins, including Booth, Guiteau believed that he was doing the country a favor. He believed that Garfield would become really unpopular and everybody would really be happy that he had done this, and that Guiteau, would get a award, would be rewarded and honored for having gunned down the President of the United States. And instead, the whole country was outraged. And the whole country then began to push for civil service reform. As for Guiteau himself, he was hung as a common criminal. All right, this may sound good, but his brains were taken out and preserved in formaldehyde to see if they could find out what would make a man do something like this. We now know they did not have the technology or the know-how to even begin to do this. We can't do this. All right. Some years ago, I saw that my daughter was getting on a computer and researching men like Jesse James, John Wesley Hardin, Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger. Any of you know any familiar with these men? Bonnie?
Yeah.
John
They were
Dillinger.
all, what they all have in common, they were all
Criminal cult almost.
yeah, they were all bad men, criminal. I said, go ahead, I do that myself.
Yeah, John.
I enjoy reading about Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. Not that I want to copy them, not at all. But I used to think when I was a young man that maybe I could figure out what made a person that way. Today I realize we can't. They made themselves that way because they wanted to be, they chose to be, they had another choice, they chose it all. And once they chose the path of bad, they could not get away from it. They just sunk lower and lower into it. Yes?
I think you hit it on the head every time when you say, we're judging men based, and we're not taking into consideration the time in which they grew up or the experience of life that they had to deal with.
Yeah.
Not to say that these guys are good at what they're doing, but you gotta remember, what were they dealing with? What did they see in front of them? And who was
In the case of Jesse James, he was a Confederate
Right.
whose side had lost.
Right.
So he was determined to keep the fight going. And also, now he made the same mistake that if Robin Hood existed, Robin Hood made. Jesse James and his men, if they saw a farmer who was dressed in rags and looked really poor, they'd stop and give this man some money. They felt like they were doing the country a service, and really, all right, if this may sound, I think I've said this before, if they'd have robbed the poor and given it to the rich, they'd actually been doing the poor a bigger favor. The richer the rich get, the richer we all get. Let them get rich. This is contrary to what a lot of folks believe, but again, Jesse James believed that he was right. And Jesse James was a religious man. His father had been a preacher. He was an avid churchgoer, but he believed that his killing and stealing was fully justified. I don't believe it was justified, but nevertheless, he did. But again, this is the way a lot of these type of people feel. They feel like that they're right in their own sight, right in their own eyes. Anyway, Congress began to work on civil service reform. Today, to get a civil service job, you have to pass a government test, among other things, and if you've served in the military, you get 5 points automatically added to your score, which gives people who serve an advantage over the other people who don't serve. And also today, for instance, an FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover by name, lasted all the way through the administrations of Coolidge, Hoover, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and finally died during the administration of Nixon. But he went through presidents, Republican and Democrat. He was initially appointed by a Republican. But again, today, when a new president is elected, you don't have an army of men just rushing to Washington to get a government job. Now, the higher up jobs, like the job of Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Interior, Department of Health, Education, Welfare, those higher up jobs, they still are appointed by the new president. But your regular bureaucratic jobs like the chairman, the man in charge of the FCC, that is a civil service job, and it does not change just because the political party in power has changed. But it took the assassination of a man, the assassinated president, to get the change done. Now, today we never hear much about the assassination of Garfield, but in those days it made news for months after, particularly when Garfield lingered alive in great pain for some 3 months after he was initially hit by a bullet, during which time he was unable to serve. And for the 3 months our country was without a president. Now today, we have the 25th Amendment. Today, the vice president would automatically take over. But in those days, we did not have a president. And so the business of the president was not done for 3 months while Garfield lingered between life and death before he finally actually passed on. Now, the next president after Garfield was Chet Arthur. Chester Arthur had been dismissed by President Hayes. Chet Arthur had been collector of the Port of New York, meant that he collected the tariffs from New York, the biggest port in the country. But he was found to be somewhat corrupt, so Chet Arthur dismissed him. But nevertheless, once Chet Arthur became president, Rutherford B. Hayes dismissed Chet Arthur. Once Chet Arthur became president, he apparently rose to the occasion, became an honest man, and gave the country something of an honest administration. All right. Tell you what, now I'm gonna pause here. Oops. Pause and call roll.